So let's just say hypothetically, you're embarking on a career as a storyboard artist and your goal is to be a storyboard artist on movies. And you've got yourself some script pages, either you wrote yourself or you found something online, you downloaded it, or maybe even your favorite book you're reading right now, you're reading it and you're thinking, you know what, maybe I'd like to storyboard some of these pages. So what we're going to talk about today is figuring out when you need to cut from one shot to another. Now you might be a seasoned pro also, and this can actually really help you too. What I want you guys to learn is to have beyond that gut sense of like, I just feel like cutting from one shot to another. I want your gut feeling to be driven by a very strong fundamental understanding of the needs for cuts and why we cut from one shot to another. And honestly, for me, this is the gospel of storyboarding. Actually, it isn't. I'm making that up. Clearly, the most important part of storyboarding is the cutting portion. And why is that? Well, if we look at films are stories told over time. A movie can be anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, sometimes 3 hours long. So you're watching an entire narrative unfold over time. And so how do you show that evolution of time? A character goes from one scene and then they're in another location. How do you do those types of transitions? You do them through cuts. So you literally need to have cuts throughout the entire film to have the story progress forward and introduce new ideas. And also, cuts really do help create a variety of shots. And those shots, because we go from one, maybe a wide to a close-up or to an over-the-shoulder or a high angle to a low angle, all those cuts help create variety, and that variety helps keep us engaged in the storytelling. So our eyes just don't glaze over. Hopefully your eyes aren't glazing over right now. So the next question we have to ask ourselves after we understand the basic necessities of why we need to cut is, when do I need to cut? Where is this gut instinct coming from? So the first part of that answer in when you cut is you let the storytelling guide you. The other big part of it is based on the camera setups and the compositions that you came up with in your board. That's a really big telling part. Once you come up with your shots and you start boarding them, those shots, depending on how wide or close you are, will help dictate when you'll need to cut based on the storytelling that you're telling in those shots. So that's the other part of the pie here, the storytelling cutting guideline pie. I think I said pie in the last video. I guess I like pie. So let's look at these pages right now and then look at the boards. So first off, we're in an interior high school waiting room by the principal's office. Sitting outside the principal's office, two superhero teenagers both sulk, avoiding eye contact with each other. One is clearly a superhero while the other is clearly a villain. They're also siblings, but we won't learn that until the end of the story. Half the villain's face is scorched. Smoke still wafts off her mostly bare scalp. You're such a jerk. He says, you're the jerk, but you're worse. You're an evildoer jerk. You jerk. And she says, well, no duh, you dimwit. Just look at me. She gestures to the obviousness of who she is. Everything about her screams villain. And I would have succeeded in my evil doing if you hadn't stopped me from taking that dumb kid's lunch money, you imbecile. And she kicks the hero's feet. We're not going to get to that part. So all we're going to really be looking at today is all this stuff right here. That's what we're going to be looking at today. So we've just read it. We hopefully are visualizing as we're reading it and we're thinking about what needs to happen. And again, the boarding part's been done. So what we're really going to look at now is how it's been visualized, how I chose to shoot it, and how I chose to reveal information. And those choices will then be guiding my choices for when I need to cut to a new shot. And those are based off of the ideas that I'm getting from the pages, meaning what I'm seeing in my head and understanding what needs to happen in the narrative. And the other part of it is, what am I coming up with and how am I interpreting the pages and how do I want to reveal the information? So personally, I'm a big fan of doing reveals, showing things a little bit at a time so that the audience can slowly take in the visual narrative. So if we look at this again, we're in an interior of a high school. We're in a waiting room by the principal's office, and we've got two kids sitting outside of the office right now. We have a superhero. They're both teenagers, and we have them sitting against a wall, and they're both sulking, and they're avoiding eye contact. So I know I have to tell that part of the story. We have one character who's clearly a superhero, and the other one is a villain. And though it's not revealed at this point in the story, they're both siblings. And so the story is really about siblings that happen to be superheroes. They grew up in the same family, but one just has that evil streak in them, and the other has the hero streak. And so it's that juxtaposition and that classic sort of the sibling rivalry the kids have, but put in the larger casing of being in a superhero high school. And so the sister, we don't know right now, half her face has been scorched. We have smoke off her head. So we know that action needs to be shown, and I need to show that stuff. And then she speaks and says, "You're a jerk." And he says, "You're a jerk back." And it begins to escalate one thing after another. So what does it look like? Let's take a look at the boards. So what did I decide to do first is, it's actually before I even do that, I'm jumping ahead of myself. I just want to say that it is a very simple set. It's designed to be a simple set. And so one way we can do to figure out our staging is to do a floor plan. And it's a very basic floor plan. This is actually the floor right here. Here's a wall. And I, again, designed this to be a very, very simple story to work on, meaning... So I designed the project to be simple from the perspective of the set. It's just a hallway and nothing more, basically 4 walls with the occasional students walking back and forth and allowing the person that's working on these ideas to really get more buried in the character performances and the acting. So there's a lot of cutting involved, a lot of fun storytelling to be discovered in the pages without being bogged down by a lot of other things. So with that said, we've got our set here. We've got the door here. The principal's office is right here. And then basically you can just have one of the students right here sitting in the chair, and the other student can be right here sitting in a chair. And then you got lockers here. There's another wall over here, and there'd be lockers there. So it's a very simple set, and it might be scale-wise, be something like that. So we know we don't have a lot of complexity with this, but we can still make the storytelling fun and compelling. So again, we have sitting outside the principal's office, 2 superhero teenagers both sulk, avoiding eye contact. So I know I have 2 characters sitting against a wall, and they're by the principal's office. And we have one character whose face has been scorched, and we have smoke coming off their head. So I wanted to highlight that idea. And I was trying to figure out, okay, how can I shoot this? How can I reveal this? If I have my shot here of the floor plan, and if I even go to something where I'm actually on the set, and I'll just do a quick drawing of that. And here's my wall, and here's my door to the principal's office here. And then I've got my students here. I've got one character right here, arms folded. And by the way, when you're doing your own boards, don't draw your characters on the same layer as your background. I'm just doing this for a floor plan, because once your characters are on here, you have to erase them all the time. It's a real pain in the butt, so don't do that. But just for this floor plan, it's okay. So I have the characters here against the wall. That's my shot. I want to show the principal's office, but I need to show the smoke coming off her head. And in a shot like this, which is very proscenium and very flat, you can see a lot of things, but we're not really guiding the eye of our audience to look where we want to look, when we want them to look at it. And so my thought was, based off the pages, I want to set up that the principal's office is here. I want to slowly reveal the hallway. And I'm not in this demo going to an exterior shot of the high school, which would really clarify the location more clearly. So in this case, I decided to start in the hallway already. And what information do we need to give the audience to give them that contextual information that we're in a high school hallway? And so I wanted to highlight the principal's office first. I thought, okay, if I can do that based off of something like this, and actually one way of just testing out the idea is if we went really tight on this shot. I have to make this really big like that. I want to highlight this idea of the office first, and we can't read the writing now because it's pretty horrible, so we'll make part of it better. And here's that shot here. And then I want to go to the smoke on the scalp to show there's a character that's been injured and hurt, and then reveal them together. And so obviously I can pan along here and reveal her, and then I can reveal him. And I also know that they have lines where she says, "You're such a jerk," and he says this too. So there's a term I call the chess move. And it's really very similar to the game of chess, where I don't play, by the way, but where great players are constantly thinking down the line as they're looking at the board, trying to figure out, I'm not sure, 5, 10 moves down the road. Maybe they think even further, but they're constantly thinking down the line of where they need to be to win. Same thing as when you're driving your car down the road and you're seeing oncoming traffic. You're always scanning down the road so you're prepared for anything that may happen. Same thing in boarding. As I'm doing these pages and I'm thinking about it and I'm visualizing in my head, maybe I'm doing thumbnails, I know that at a certain point, I got to reveal both of them sitting side by side right here. They're side by side. I need to show that her head is scorched, and I need to show the principal's office. I can't show all those things at the same time because then we're not telling the audience where we want them to look at any particular time. I want to guide the experience of the audience to look exactly where I want them to look. So what I decided to do is start off with a shot like this very shot where we're on the window, we're actually on the glass of the principal's office, and we have this smoldering smoke in the background, but everything is thrown off into soft focus. You're not really seeing it, but it draws the eye over there. But by that point, hopefully, we will have seen enough of this location to see, oh, principal's office. Okay, I know where that is. I already know by reading this, the location. And so by doing that, I fulfilled that story point already. That first point is done. I've established the principal's office. I can check that off. That's the first story point, number one. So the next part is I need to show the superhero kids both sulking, avoiding eye contact. I've got to show the smoke and the kid's head that's been torched. So my feeling is I'm doing it a bit reverse. Even though I wrote it in one direction, I'm reorganizing it because I want to tell the story slightly differently. I think it's more focused. So in order to tell that next story point, which is half the villain's face is scorched, smoke still wafts off her mostly bare scalp, I am going to do that in this shot. And so with the cutting guideline, which I haven't even laid out yet, my cutting guideline is basically you only cut when you can no longer tell the story in your current shot, which means if I can tell that next part in the shot, then I don't have a need to cut. This is a general guideline, by the way. In this case, I have the smoldering scalp in the background, and I know I can tell that next piece of story if I have the camera move over and follow the smoke. So the camera move and the rack focusing off of the principal's office to this is a motivated camera move because the audience is starting to see something in the background like, hey, what is moving in that? Oh, let's take a look. So the camera sees it and then moves over. And so now we're seeing smoldering head and we're seeing this big shock of red hair. So we're not yet revealing her. And I love doing reveals, as I mentioned earlier on. And so I thought this would be a fun way to reveal her in the shot and tell the story. So now we pan down to her. In the background, we have students moving there. So it's, again, selling the idea that we're in a high school. We see two characters sitting right here in this shot. I'm going back and forth just to show you the smoldering part. And I have her brother here sitting in the next to her, but we don't see him very clearly. And so the entire story point of this one shot is to show her face is scorched and smoke is still coming off her head. So that's the story point right here in this shot. And I have fulfilled that story point. I've gone from one point here, the principal's office, all the way to the smoldering head. By doing that, I've fulfilled both of those ideas. So now the next part of the story is I got to show them more clearly. I have to show the superhero very clear, and I have to show them sitting next to each other but not looking at each other. And then as I was boarding it, I came up with an idea that I hadn't written, and I think this idea will make the storytelling clearer, more clear. Boy, I don't speak very well. It's going to make it clear. So what did I have to do? So I thought, okay, I can't tell that story point in this shot where they're both calling each other a jerk. It wouldn't be clear enough. I'm starting the narrative and the story off without even really introducing this other character next to her. So I knew I needed to cut to a new shot. And by cutting to this new shot, I'm motivating the cut, or the cut itself is motivated because it's motivated to tell a new piece of the storytelling that I couldn't quite tell very clearly in this previous shot. So the cut becomes meaningful, and we want our cuts to be meaningful. We want our cuts to show new information or additional information that we couldn't clearly show in our previous shot. And by doing that, we're advancing the storytelling. This is a term, by the way, that gets used a lot in the industry, advancing the storytelling. So by going to this shot right here, I'm advancing a new idea and a newer part of the narrative that is the continuation of the story that I couldn't tell in this shot, which is, I thought it'd be fun to show some students walking by in the foreground and talking about them and giving a little bit of exposition. So as they walk by, these are superhero kids. So he says under his breath, bro, those two just can't stay out of trouble. Yeah. So they laugh as they go by. And this piece of dialogue, those two just can't stay out of trouble, is exposition, giving the audience a little bit more context about these two characters in the background. And that information is that these two characters get into it often. They constantly get in trouble, and that's reinforcing that sibling rivalry that we'll learn later on in the story. So by doing this, it's telling the audience that these kids end up sitting in front of the principal's office probably 2 or 3 times a week. And so that helps reinforce the story, gives us a little bit more context before we jump into it. So then after that part, which wasn't scripted, and by the way, these are things that we do on a daily basis working on movies. Majority of my career was at DreamWorks. I was there for 17 years, and I learned all this stuff while I was there. And I've noticed I knew a lot of great people that would do the same thing. You get stuff in the pages, you have ideas that are thrown in also by the artists all the time, whether you're writing dialogue or you're showing visual stuff. And as long as you're being dialed in on the theme and the story and what needs to happen, oftentimes your ideas end up in the movie. And that's a very satisfying and fun thing. So in this case, there is a piece right here that I inserted, and that's where the students walk by here and they laugh and they give us that exposition about these two getting in trouble all the time. So that's stuff that I added in here in this wide shot. And then I knew from off of that part, I needed to have this part where the villain says, "You are such a jerk." And he says, "You're the jerk, but you're worse. You're an evil doer jerk. You jerk." So can I tell that piece of the storytelling in my current shot? And the answer is yes. So I'm not going to cut. I'm going to start that dialogue right here. As they go by, she says, "You are such a jerk." And then he says, "You're the jerk." So I can show them in this shot very clearly. It also shows their body language, which I couldn't show in the previous shot. It shows that the brother is sort of like leaning away from her. So body language is very, very useful in understanding and drawing out so that we get a sense of how they feel. So that's a piece of storytelling I could tell in this shot. The other piece is that I have a smoldering head going on here, and I didn't want to deal with it for the rest of the sequence. I wanted the smoke to slowly fade out. And so as these guys walk by, I began to turn the opacity down on the smoke. And it's a 2-frame cycle, and I would turn it down by a percentage or 3% or 5% on each part of it. So by the time I get to my next cut, it's gone and we don't think about it anymore. So now that I have her say, "You're such a jerk," and he goes, "You're the jerk," I wanted to cut out of this wide shot because he has a line coming up here, and that line is, "You're the jerk," which I just did. But the other part I really want to highlight is that, "But you're worse. You're an evil doer jerk." And that line, "but you're worse," is important. And I want to see his face clearly on this line for him to deliver this, that not only is she a jerk, but she's a specific type of jerk. She's an evil doer jerk. And that line I couldn't tell in my shot because I wanted to get in tighter on his face. So in order to make that happen, I needed to cut to a new shot. And by cutting to that new shot, it will be purposeful. It will have meaning because I'm going to be zeroing in on his face to highlight this thought about his sister. And so what did I do to motivate that cut? I have him turn his head away and he sniffs sort of like dismissively. And he says, just for context, he says, "You're the jerk." And on the action, I cut to a close-up of his face, turning away from his sister. Oftentimes when we're having conflict with people, we turn our heads away. So when I'm boarding these things, I'm actually thinking about the acting and how I would behave or how you'd behave. You don't want to look people in the eye. You turn away from them. You scowl. And I thought by having him turn into camera dramatically on the cut of the snort, then I can still keep his sister in the background, which I do right here. She's in the background. We see her in silhouette. And we have more students in the background, again, keeping that high school feeling alive. And then he can deliver the line, which is, and I'll go back here again, "Except you're worse. You're an evildoer jerk." So I'm going to stop right here. "You're an evildoer jerk." He turns around to her, and I need to see her reaction. And I know she has a line. So her line is, "Well, no, duh, you dimwit, just look at me." So I know she has a line coming up. And the question is, can I tell that story point in this shot right here? And the answer is no, I can't really tell it. I mean, I could have her lean forward and say that line, but I also wanted to see her expression more clearly, and I had some acting ideas that I wanted to try, and I thought by cutting to a flat shot of her, it would allow him to continue that last line. We have one more line here from him, which is, he says, "You're an evildoer jerk, you jerk." So that line I haven't done yet, and I wanted to have him whisper it in her ear. I can imagine siblings, they get each other's faces and they have no problem like yelling at them. And so I thought that would be a fun way to introduce that idea. And it would add more conflict to the story, and that would make her then push back at him to escalate the conflict. So I know I couldn't tell it in this shot. So I had to cut to a new shot, which is this flat shot of her looking pissed off. And then he can come in, "You jerk." And so by doing it in this cut, I can have a little bit of a joke here where he turns, he says, "You're an evildoer jerk." And we have a pause and he comes in to finish the line, "You jerk." And then she has a line which is, "Well, no, duh, you dimwit, just look at me." So can I tell part of this line or the entire part of that line in my current shot? Well, I know I can start it, but I also know that this particular line, just look at me, is something where she's going to gesture to herself. And this is that chess move I was talking about where I'm looking down here at the pages. I know that there's a part where she gestures to the obviousness of her, who she is. Everything about her screams villain. So I'm thinking in my head, oh, like a villain belt buckle and villain is on her gloves and she does bad things. And I want to highlight these visual things, which means it's a physical moment for our character. I need to get her wide enough in a shot where she can be like this and say like, no, duh, like here I am, look at me. And so we have to see the entirety of this character to be able to have her gesture to her whole body, like, look at me. Like it's beyond obvious how bad I am and what a bad person I am. So I knew I needed to cut to a wider shot for that. But I knew that I could begin that line with the well-no, duh, you dimwit in that 2-shot. And so I stayed in that shot. So as he comes in, you jerk, I have her sigh. Well, no, duh, you double-digit dimwit. So I added the double digit in here. That's an extra line I thought of as I was boarding it. I thought it'd be a little funnier and it hints at like an IQ thing. And so this is, again, a thing that often happens when you're boarding. It really is the kind of the source of creation and coming up with ideas and creativity. I often think of it like the synapses in our brain are really hyper focused. And when we're on a specific part of the dialogue and the acting, that's where I feel like all reserves are online. Everything in my head is being used to figure out and problem solve. And I think there's parts in the story that I even was thinking, I have a garage gym and I was getting a little workout in, and I'm still thinking about the story, and you'll see that part later on in here. But I came up with some solutions while I was in the garage exercising. And so I do feel like there's a huge benefit to getting off your butt, taking your dogs for a walk if you have a dog. If you don't have a dog, just go for a walk. But getting away from the material and letting your mind do that work subconsciously as you're doing other things, your mind does a lot of great things, and it does a lot of problem solving for you when you're doing these things. So oftentimes for me, either I'm walking my dogs and I'm thinking about it and the ideas pop in my head, or I'm, in the old days when I was actually physically in the studio, I'd be driving back and I'd have an idea and I'd get my iPhone and I'd start saying those ideas. I'd record them to myself so I remember them. So that's a big part of the process of boarding. You're not literally doing every single thing the way it's written, scripted. We have a lot of room to actually create. So she says that line, and I knew again from the chess move that I have her saying, just look at me, which is this part right here, just look at me. So I need to get to that part where I have the camera wide enough to allow her to gesture that. So, and I also had this moment where she's butting him in the head and pushing him. Basically, he's, whispering in her ear and instigating her and like poking her, being the instigator here. And so she pushes back and raises it a level by not only talking to his face, but now pushing him back out of her own personal space. These things were not scripted. And this is honestly true when you get a script on a movie. The writer isn't writing down what the characters are doing. Not all the time. Some writers think very visually. Other writers are great with dialogue and they leave the scene descriptions pretty bare bones. And so it's really up to us to invent it and create it. And that's the stuff that I love the most. So in this case, I thought, okay, if he's going to whisper in her ear and get in her face, then she'll just take it one more level and push him back out of her own personal space and getting him back to where he was before. So she pushes him all the way back like a bull. I knew I could begin part of that storytelling in this shot, but I would need to cut, and this is the part where he's going off camera, I need to cut wider to finish that action. So by cutting to the shot, it's purposeful, and I'm showing information that I couldn't show in my previous shot. So this shot becomes meaningful because it's information that couldn't be seen or learned from the previous one. So each time I cut, I'm advancing the next part of the storytelling. I'm advancing the next part of the narrative. So every cut becomes purposeful, every cut becomes meaningful, and every cut is advancing the storytelling. So by having her lean forward and she pushes him back, she says, "No duh, you double-digit dimwit." And now I had that part, just look at me. And I knew I could begin that part here. I needed to have her stand back from him. I needed to have her get away from him so that she could begin to gesture and he'd be able to take in the entire picture. So I thought, okay, I can have her begin to back up towards camera in the shot and then finish the line, just, look at me. And I knew I couldn't finish that piece of the storytelling in this shot. So I needed to cut to a new angle, which was this shot right here. It's a reverse angle over the shoulder of our hero character. And the reason why I cut over his shoulder is I want to link the characters on the set. I want to constantly remind the audience where they are in relationship to each other. So by cutting over his shoulder, I keep him alive as a character, and we as the audience are experiencing the storytelling from his perspective. Not literally his point of view. We're not looking through his eyes, but we're sitting with him watching her finish this performance here. And the line is, "No duh, you double-digit dimwit. Just look at me." And a nerdy student walks by. She looks at her, and then she cranks her head and goes, "Hmm?" And so I put the nerdy kid coming through the shot, and she's a superhero kid too. I put her through the shot because I wanted to remind the audience we're in a high school hallway. Kids are constantly going back and forth. And I thought that would be a fun way of sort of breaking up her dramatic performance and showing how other kids just don't respect her or them or anybody. Kids are sort of in their own place. And so she has to wait for her to walk by to finish her performance. So now we're at the next part of the storytelling, which is here. She gestures to the obviousness of who she is. Everything about her screams villain. I purposefully left this part vague, and it's designed to let the student who takes my class try to figure out, well, what does this actually look like? What is she gesturing to? What is she showing that says I'm a villain? Or what is she doing? And so in this case, a lot of the ideas were based off of some ideas I had when I was actually walking my dogs. And the other part is me trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the visual ways that are going to have her show him her villainness, her evil parts? So I knew I could begin that storytelling here, but I wanted to go in tight on her face. And I had this idea that basically she has words inscribed on her gloves and all over the place. So I knew that it would not be very clear in the wide. I want to guide the eyes of the audience to look exactly where I want them to look. And when you have words on a screen or signage, you want to punch in there tight so the audience can read it very clearly. I couldn't tell that in this shot. So I cut to a close-up of her off of this shot here. She puts her arms wide, and this wide arm movement is a good way to motivate the cut. And so I'll go back for context. Just look at me. She walks by, and I cut to this close-up, and she raises one glove, and it says super, and she raises the other one, evil. So now I had this rhythm of ideas, and then she pulls a fist back, never, nice. And then opens her palms, up, yours. And then we pull back, and she pulls her lip down, and we go, evil. 24/7, 365. So she has the word evil and 24/7, 365 tattooed in her lip. And so everything about her is evil. Then I had another idea about having her wear a Letterman's jacket like she's in high school. So she turns around and she points to the varsity villain. And so that's the high school link I wanted to have. And I imagine this is sort of that stitched in furry lettering you'd have on a high school jacket. So all the storytelling I was able to tell in this close-up shot. And by focusing the eye of the audience more clearly by having to do the action, because there was a version of this where I don't have the boards in front of me here. Actually, let me see if I can find those boards. Okay, here it is. In the other rough version, I had her raise her hand in the wide. And then I cut to the close-up so you could read it. And I just thought, you know what? It'd be much more entertaining if I told the story from the perspective of her raising her fists into camera on a close-up. So that's why I chose to do it in this shot right here, so she can raise them up, and then we can guide the eye of the audience to read exactly what we want and make it a curated experience. So by having her do it like this, super evil. And so she's playing off of what he said, you're super evil. And yes, I am super evil. And then I thought, okay, I'm going to play off of the old joke of, some gang members and people have like words tatted on their fingers. So I thought that could be funny to play off of that idea. So then she punches to camera, and by punching to camera, I threw her in soft focus in the background, even more soft focus to hyper focus the idea and the eyes on these things like that. So if I'm coming towards camera, this is a webcam. It's not going to rack focus at all, but I want to focus the eyes of the audience on these fists. So by having her punch each one out individually, we can read them. Never, nice. So we got that. And then I thought, it'd be funny if there's something on her palm. So everywhere along the line, there's something there that will reinforce the idea that she's a jerk. Then up yours. And then I thought the last thing, as she brings her hands here, she can pull the lip down. All the storytelling I could obviously tell in this medium close-up. So I didn't need to cut. I could tell the story here. And then I punched in, boom, on a big dramatic poof. And then the big part of this is I can't read what's on her lip. So that will necessitate a cut to make the storytelling clearer. And by cutting, like always, We're advancing the storytelling. We're clarifying an idea that we couldn't make very clear in this shot so the audience can follow along with the storytelling. So by going even closer and then have a little like a glistening light go over the lip, the moist, wet lip. We have evil 24/7, 365. And this even helps sort of like read the words and highlight this whole concept. And once we finished telling this piece of the storytelling, I had one more idea of her pointing to her back and her Letterman's jacket. I couldn't tell that story point in this shot. So what do I have to do? I got to cut back to the shot that I had already, which is great. I didn't have to draw it again. And I just have her flip around and use her thumbs to point. And then we pan down and we punch in one more time to read the word varsity villains. So now that I fulfilled all of that storytelling, the next part of the storytelling is that she has a line that says, and I would have succeeded in my evil doing if you hadn't stopped me from taking that dumb kid's lunch money, you imbecile. So the question is, can I tell that piece of the storytelling in this shot? Well, guess what? I also realized that I needed to have off of this stuff a reaction from the brother. Didn't script it, but I realized that reaction shots are incredibly important. We need to get a temperature check of the characters that are in the scenes, the characters that are being addressed to, and that are being affected by what's going on. And so I need to show him reacting to this, all this stuff. Like she's saying, like, look at me, look at this, look at that, look at that. Everything about me is screaming, I'm evil, I'm bad, I'm horrible. And we need to get a reaction. What's the appropriate reaction from a sibling who wants to show that he doesn't give a crap? Well, you show a guy with the half lids and he goes, like, I don't give a crap. I don't care. So I knew I couldn't tell that story point in this shot. I had to cut to a medium close-up of the brother looking on, bored and rolling his eyes and saying, because he's seen it all and he's not giving her any love. He's not validating her experience at all. And from a perspective of conflict, which is imperative in storytelling, you've got to have conflict in your stories. Without conflict, you've got nothing at all. You've got nothing that propels the story forward. By him blowing her off, it just kind of gets her a little bit more pissed at him to then continue the next piece of the dialogue. So I needed to have her react and say that line, which is, and I would have gotten away with that kid's money if he hadn't stopped me, which is a very Scooby-Doo line. I couldn't tell that in this shot. So I cut to a reverse angle over the hero's shoulder, matching continuity. He's looking up towards screen right. So I have him looking up here. He's not giving her any love. And she turns and looks at him, pissed off, like, dude, you're blowing me off. And she starts that line, and I would have succeeded in my evil doing. And I knew that I wanted to get her to a profile shot of him and about to kick him, but I know I couldn't tell that part of the story in this shot. And the other reason why I cut to the over the shoulder is I wanted to, again, show their relationship of where they are on the set. Because I was in these close-ups for a while, I didn't have them together in any shots. And so I wanted to link them again. I'm a big fan of constantly reminding everybody where they are. Even the shot of him reacting to the varsity villains is a single. So I wanted to cut over his shoulder after he turns his head to finish that and linking it back to her. So she hears that and then looks back and like, oh, what a jerk. And she says, and I would have succeeded in my evil doing. So that part of the line I can tell, which is this part right here, I would succeed in my evil doing. But the next part is, if you hadn't stopped me from taking that dumb kid's lunch money, you imbecile. So I knew I couldn't tell that part of the story in this two shot. She began to get lost. I want to see his expression again of sort of like being disinterested. I knew I couldn't tell that in this shot. So therefore, I needed to cut to a new shot to continue the narrative. And what shot did I come up with? A proscenium, sort of a low camera angle where he's sitting up here looking up towards the ceiling. We have kids in the background again to sell the school. And I have her coming in, pointing accusingly at him. And she'll say, and I would have succeeded in my evil doing if you hadn't stopped me from taking that dumb kid's lunch money, you imbecile. And then she looks down and dismissively kicks him in the shin and goes to sit down, stares at him, and slumps back. And I did this kick right here, as opposed to having her do something really evil, like punch him in the face or do some magic or whatever her powers were, which I actually never really figured out. But I thought it'd be funnier and maybe more sibling-like just to kick somebody because you're so upset with them, and yet you don't find them important enough to actually do something really bad to them. So all you're willing to do is give them a kick in the shin. And that's what she does. And then she'll sit down and slump because she's tired of him. This wide shot is hopefully giving us some breathing room We're a little tight. We have been tight on a lot of these shots. And so that's what I was talking about earlier on in the video, that compositions, when we're wide and we're tight and we're going high and we're low, by having a contrast of these different camera distances from our characters and different locations helps create a variety of shots, helps keep the storytelling look visually fresh, and also allows us, the most important part, to continue telling the story clearly. So by cutting to this wide shot here of her walking towards him, I can have her approach him. It's also nice to show that she's not a big character. She's a bit petite. He's a big oafish character. And so that contrast is very clear here. The other thing I wanted to highlight is that I'm a big fan of taking the dialogue and breaking it up so that I'm covering the specific visual action on here, and it's done to give the editor a better idea of the timing that I'm hoping will happen. And I'm trying to give enough poses in here to cover the dialogue clearly. So let's take a quick look at that part here. He goes, "Pfft." And I would have succeeded in my evil doing if you hadn't stopped me from taking that dumb kid's lunch money. So every pose is broken down to cover pieces of dialogue that I want to highlight with a physical movement and physicality of the character to highlight that dialogue. And I feel like in the space of time that she walks here, this action is long enough to cover this dialogue. If you hadn't stopped me from taking that dumb kid's lunch money, the lunch money is an accent on the idea, and she's again pushing into him to be aggressive and to show that I don't take any shit from you. And then she stands back, you imbecile, and then she's closed her mouth, and then that's when she would look down and give him a kick in the shin. So again, every cut is motivated. Every cut is designed to continue telling the story. And the first part of it, again, like I said before, your first part is let the script pages guide you, let it help you. And then the next question is, as you're reading this stuff, you begin to ask yourself, well, what's it going to look like? That's the next part of the puzzle. You start staging and blocking. You begin to come up with your compositions like this. And then you begin to fulfill the dialogue and the acting. And as you're doing it, you might realize, okay, I have something else that's going to come up. I need to be a little bit wider. Like in this shot, for example, I know I'm going to have her kick him in the shin. So that was part of the chess move. I need to be wide enough to see that. And this shot will allow me to have her kick him in the shin and then have him get upset. So every time I'm doing this, I'm constantly thinking down the road of where I need to be. And that will help guide me to understand where I can put my cameras in order to be an effective visual storyteller. So what can you do if you're starting out and you're trying this for the first time? Go online, do a Google search and type in script pages or screenplays, download a movie, and actually start looking at some of the script pages and try to break them down. And as you're doing it, think about your cuts, when you're going to cut, and you're going to do it because you're going to be thoughtful and you're going to say to yourself, okay, I figured out this one shot. I've got my acting in here. And now there's a part where the character grabs a watch, but I can't see the watch because it's in my pocket. So I need to cut to a close-up of the pocket and see the hand come in there. Every cut then will be designed to continue propelling the story forward, propelling the narrative forward, and hyper-focusing the eyes of the audience to look where you want to look. Okay, you got this. You can do it. Peace out.